Hello, my name is Joshua Goldstein, and this is my group's behavior change project. We did it on a study called The Effects of Video Self-Evaluation on Skills Acquisition with Yoga Postures. Our group members are Christy Bowen, Courtney Crawley, myself, Joshua Goldstein, Maria Kostman, Savannah Paddock, and Lauren Signer. We're going to begin with reviewing some comparative literature about video self-evaluation. The first study that I'm going to talk about researched whether self-evaluation was effective when implementing a behavior change program. They used a kindergarten boy, his name was Scott, and he was non-compliant with his parents' instructions. They took him to the Meyer Children's Rehabilitation Institute, and they did a treatment in his house. There were 6 instructions that were given to him by his mother, and he had to decide if he was compliant with them or non-compliant with them. If he decided that he was compliant with them, he could give himself a token. If he received 4 out of 6 tokens, then he was able to give himself a reward such as an edible. They were done in a reversal design, an ABC, ABC, ABC design. The A phase was a baseline. The B phase was a self-evaluation phase, and a phase where his mother helped. It was called the maternal evaluation phase. In that phase, he could only get a token if he agreed with his mom, if he was compliant with the instructions given. So that phase was meant to help him be accurate when self-evaluating the phase. And what the results showed was after he had the maternal evaluation, his behaviors for non-compliance decreased, and he cooperated more, and he completed the tasks more often versus when it was just a self-evaluation phase. This showed of self-evaluation is very important because when he was only self-evaluating, they noticed that he was always giving himself the token whether or not he was compliant or not. Some other studies regarding self-evaluation helped teach neurotypical kids strategies to be social with a peer with autism. So, some preschool students were taught some skills such as sharing, initiating conversation with a peer with autism, imitating their peer, playing with them, and other social strategies. And this was very important because peers, especially at very young ages, such as preschool, which was this kids, really need a lot of peer imitation to help develop their social skills. So teaching children who are neurotypical, who may not want to go up to somebody with autism, skills to interact with them is very important to help the kids with autism. So what they did was, during baseline, they just saw how many times the kids interacted with the children with autism. And then they did a training phase where an adult would sit with the neurotypical child and teach them to go up to kids with autism, and they would or share a toy with the kid with autism or imitate what the kid with autism is doing. And they practice this with an adult. And then they did a self-evaluation phase where they asked the kids to rate themselves whether or not they did these strategies when they're interacting with the kids with autism. And as you can see from this graph, when they were training, it kind of remained pretty consistent to where the levels of interaction were when they were working with the kids playing with the kids with autism. But once the children started self-evaluating themselves, then they started interacting with the kids with autism a lot more. There was another study that was used to help staff implement a behavior plan, was high integrity. These staff were picked because they had low integrity scores when implementing a behavior plan, and they really needed to become better at implementing the behavior plan. So what they did was these staff were trained to watch a video of somebody implementing the behavior plan and implement it. Then they were recorded, and then they had to record they had implementing the behavior plan. And once they started recording themselves, they could see what they were doing. And 2 out of the 3 participants started implementing the behavior plan at 100% accuracy. And now Christy is going to talk about some other studies.
Okay, I'm going to quickly overview 2 other studies that showed the effects of self-evaluation. The first study is interesting in that it didn't have a grading system for the self-evaluation, but I'll jump more into that in a second. So this study was with a group of young gymnasts, between 7 and 10 years old, women gymnasts, and they were asked to engage in a gymnastics skill. They recorded while they were engaging in the skill, and then once they were finished engaging in the skill, they were asked to immediately come view the video of themselves engaging in the skill. Now, at this point, the self-evaluation happened when they watched themselves in the video, but also right next to their video was a professional model of who was engaging in the same skill that they were practicing. So in this study, they saw that there was a functional relationship between increasing the accuracy of the skill and this self-evaluation intervention. The second study I'm going to just quickly overview was a study conducted with 40 nursing students. So this study was very similar to our study that we did our replication project on. So this study, like I said, had 40 nursing students. They were broken up into 2 groups, the experimental group and the control group, with 20 members in each group. The targeted skills here were competency in applying a Foley catheter, as well as communication with the patient while the procedure was being done, and an and learning motivation. So what happened is that both the control group and the experimental group underwent video recording in the pre-test phase, but the difference in the experimental group was that these students were then sent a video clip of their application of the Foley catheters and their communication with the patient. They were then asked to evaluate themselves based on a task analysis in both competency of applying the Foley catheter as well as communication with the patient. They were also asked to do a survey on learning motivation. So this study also found that the experimental group had higher rates in all 3 acquisition skills, and that was the group that was asked to self-evaluate based on those task analyses. So I'm going to give it back to Josh, who's going to talk a little bit more about the purpose of our study.
So the study that we are replicating was called The Effects of Video Self-Evaluation on Skill Acquisition with Yoga Postures by Miltenberger, Biedronski, and Witherspoon. This study looked at helping 2 individuals increase the accuracy of their yoga pose when they were learning yoga for the first time. And the purpose of that study was to test if video self-evaluation was an effective method to increase the accuracy of yoga poses when learning a new skill. Yoga is an exercise that can be very beneficial to somebody's health, but if not implemented correctly, can lead to injuries. And we decided that we wanted to replicate this study because we wanted to see if video self-evaluation is an effective way to learn a new skill, such as yoga pose. We were all interested in learning yoga because it's a very good exercise to increase strength and endurance and muscle tone.
I will be discussing the participants and setting. In the original study, there were 2 participants, ages 21 and 24. Both of them were males. These participants did not have injuries and did not have any experience in yoga. They were attending college, and the study took place at the college fitness lab on their campus. The participants did not practice yoga outside of the study. In our replicated study, there were 6 participants. Our age range was 24 to 27. There were 5 females and 1 male. We had no prior experience in yoga. Each of the participants were able to do the yoga poses, but there were some limitations. There were 2 pregnancies, Christy and Maria, and there was 1 medical injury at the 10th session mark, and that was Maria. We did not practice yoga outside of the study. The settings did vary from participant to participant. Most of the sessions took place in the home setting. There were 2 participants that took a vacation. That was Christy and Savannah. So these baseline sessions took place in the hotel room.
The materials that we used were a camera with recording, a laptop, there was an optional yoga mat, a room with enough room to engage in yoga moves that was clear of any obstructions that might skew data. We needed access to the internet to gain access to yoga video links and access to communication with partners, as well as a task analysis.
Our study utilized the exact same targeted behaviors as the original study. These behaviors are 3 common yoga poses that are typically taught in a beginning yoga class. They include the tree pose, the warrior 2 pose, and the downward facing dog pose. The first behavior is called the tree pose. As you can see in the picture, once the pose is completed, the body will resemble a standing tree. This behavior is defined as placing the weight of your body into your left foot while your right foot is pressed into your inner thigh. The hands are pressed together in front of your body at chest level and eyes are looking forward at a focal point. The participant remains in this pose for at least 30 seconds. The second behavior is called the warrior 2 pose. This behavior is defined as standing with the feet 3.5 to 4 feet apart with arms parallel to the floor, reaching out to the sides with palms down. The participant will turn one foot slightly inward and the other foot to a 90-degree angle. The participant then bends the front knee over her ankle so her shin is perpendicular to the floor. Next, she extends her arms out and looks over her shoulder toward her right fingers. The participant will hold this pose for 30 seconds. The third and last targeted behavior is called the downward facing dog pose. This behavior is defined by placing the hands and feet on the ground while the arms, back, and legs are straightened. The participant brings her head in to face her shins and remains in this pose for at least 30 seconds. In our replication study, all participants collected and recorded data as closely as possible to the procedures in the original study. In both our study and the original study, participants recorded themselves performing each yoga pose and collected data on the accuracy of the pose using a task analysis specific to each pose. Since the task analysis utilized in the original study were unavailable, we created our own task analysis for each pose to be used in the study. The participants go through the task analysis and mark either a plus sign for a correctly observed step or a minus sign for a skipped or incorrect step. The task analyses for the tree pose and the warrior 2 pose can be seen here. The tree pose lists 9 steps. So the participant would add up the pluses or correct steps, divide that number by 9, and multiply it by 100 to obtain a percentage of correct steps. The warrior 2 pose task analysis lists 10 steps. So the participant would add up the correct steps, divide that number by 10, and multiply it by 100 to obtain a percentage of correct steps. On the next slide, you see the downward facing dog pose task analysis, which lists 6 steps. So the participant would add up his or her correct steps, divide that number by 6, and multiply it by 100 to obtain the percentage of correct steps.
I'm going to talk about baseline and intervention. In our replication project, we attempted to closely replicate all procedures in both baseline and intervention, but I'll also talk about some differences that were needed between our study and the original study. So some things that were the same is we utilized the multiple baseline across behaviors, research design, the same way that the original study did. Also, as it has been mentioned previously, no one in either study engaged in yoga outside of their research design. The third thing that was important to know was the same, is that no coaching or feedback was given in baseline trials in either the original study or the replication study. Next. So, excuse me. One of the important differences between our original study and the replication study was that in the original study, the researcher was actually present with the participant and acted as a model in the first 2 sessions for each yoga pose. So the participant was asked to engage in these yoga poses, but first the researcher went ahead and modeled what the yoga poses are to look like. We weren't able to do that step based on our distance and the fact that we weren't able to find one person that could model for all of us. So what we did instead was we utilized videos from yogajournal.com that modeled these 3 simple yoga poses to provide any sort of instruction or feedback, but were just used so that we could replicate the study as closely to the original study as possible, even with some limitations and distances. One other difference between our original study and the replication study is in the way based in our study versus the original study. So in the original study, there was video taken of the baseline poses, and that video was then graded by outside observers, observers who were neither researcher nor participant. However, in our replication study, again, because of the nature of our situation and being online and being distant, being far in distance, we did record our baseline sessions the same way, in the same method, but we then sent our baseline videos to another member of the group. Each one of us had one specific partner. That partner then would grade our baseline sessions. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have anything to do with grading our own baseline sessions, as that would skew the data. So we weren't allowed to see our data or results, so that other partner also graphed our participation or our accuracy in each pose, and would let us know when a pose was ready to go into intervention. So in intervention, for both of our studies, both the original study and the replication study, participants recorded their yoga sessions and then immediately evaluated their performance using the task analysis. So like Lauren said, we would then give ourselves a plus or a minus, depending on if we felt like we had engaged in the pose correctly. For utilizing the multiple baseline approach, each of us would record our baseline sessions, and our partner would be evaluating our data. All 3 poses started in baseline, and our partner would let us know when the first pose had reached stability, and then would let us know to go ahead and put that one pose in intervention. So across all of us, we have a different number of sessions and a different number of baseline and intervention for each pose because of this. So that pose would go to intervention, and then once that pose reached stability and intervention, the next most stable baseline pose would also be introduced in intervention. And this would continue until all of our poses were in the intervention stage. One main difference between our original study and the replication study is in the training used for task analysis. So in the original study, the researcher again sat with participants while analyzing the task analysis and letting the participant know when a pose or a step in a pose would be marked as correct or incorrect. And so this was training that occurred. Next slide. And in our replication study, no coaching was able to be given to participants in how to grade the task analysis. So no one was told what would be a correct or incorrect answer. We were just looking at the task analysis and grading it to the best of our ability, as there wasn't one trainer that could train all of us on being accurate in that task analysis. So in the same way, in the original study, once treatment fidelity fell low, retraining on the task analysis was then conducted. So this was something that we weren't able to engage in, as training had never been given on the task analysis either way. So that is a portion of our replication study that was different than the original study, is that retraining did not take place as treatment fidelity fell low. So due to the distance of group members, there were certain changes that we needed to make in baseline and intervention while we tried to stick closely to the original study and replicate the study and see and then be able to evaluate our results between the two studies. I'm going to pass on to Courtney, who's going to discuss IOA and treatment fidelity.
Okay. In the original study, inter-observer agreement data was calculated for 33% of all of the video recording sessions for each participant. Our group used this percentage as well. The percentage of agreement was calculated by utilizing the following formula. Number of agreements divided by the number of steps in the corresponding task analysis, then multiplied by 100. The group members partnered with another participant within the group to code their videos and compare to the task analysis. The mean IOA percentages for each participant is as follows. Lauren, 96%, Christy, 100%, Joshua, 89.25%, Savannah, 90.2%, Maria, 95%, and Courtney, 94%. Treatment fidelity was tested by calculating the percentage of agreement for occurrences of correct poses during task analysis completion in the self-evaluation videos. The interval by interval formula was used for treatment fidelity, which is when the number of agreements is divided by the number of steps in the task analysis, then multiplied by 100. Treatment fidelity was divided between two groups to replicate the study's divide in participants. 50% of the videos were scored for Group A and 38% of videos for Group B. Group A included Courtney, Joshua, and Maria. Courtney's range was 89 to 100%, Maria 50 to 81%, and Joshua 75 to 100%. Group B included Lauren, Savannah, and Christy. Lauren's range was 83 to 100%, Savannah 83 to 100%, and Christy 71 to 100%. 3 participants, Christy, Josh, and Maria, did report fidelity scores under 80%.
I'll be discussing the results of our study. Our results showed that there was an increase of correct yoga poses when video self-evaluation or VSE was implemented. When interpreting the data, the baseline is doing the 3 yoga poses without guidance. The VSE allowed the participants to evaluate the yoga pose, gain correct steps per the task analysis, and improve their percentages during the intervention. The data can be analyzed as if there's a positive correlation seen, the intervention worked. If there's a negative correlation, the intervention did not work. If there is no trend, there would have been no impact by the intervention. During our project, the intervention did have an impact, and our data presented a functional relationship. This implies that behavior changes with changes of an independent variable. Our dependent variable of the yoga pose was impacted by the independent variable of the self-evaluation. The functional relationship can be seen when the VSE was implemented and the change of data shifted to higher percentages. This is the demonstration of the functional relationship. So we can see in the next slide of figure 2 of Christy's poses, her graphs showed the strong functional relationship. And then the next slide shows figures 3 and 5 of Lauren and Josh's. And there's our strong relationships. And then figures of Savannah, Maria, and Lauren do have dips, but this does not disrupt our functional relationships. Now we can scroll back up to Christy's graph, and she will elaborate more on her results.
So I'm going to talk about my averages in baseline and intervention for each pose. So my baseline average for my downward dog pose was 23%, and the baseline range was between 17% and 33%. When intervention was introduced, my intervention range, or my intervention average, moved to 93.3%, and the range was 67% to 100%. In Warrior 2, my baseline average was 48%, and my baseline range was between 40 and 60%. In the intervention, average was 93%, and the range was 90% to 100%. Then in tree pose, my average was 50%, the baseline range being 33% and between 33% and 67%. The intervention average was 95.3%, and the range was 78% to 100%.
And now I'm going to talk about my results. For my tree pose, my baseline average was 72.5% with a range of 56 to 78%. After intervention was implemented, I had an average of 95.3% with a range of 70 to 100% correct steps. In my Warrior II pose, my baseline average was 62.1% with a baseline range of 50 to 80%. Then my intervention average was 90% with a range of 70 to 100% correct steps. And lastly, my downward facing dog baseline average was 65.1% with a range of 50 to 83%. And once I entered intervention for that pose, my average was 87.3% with a range of 66 to 100% correct steps.
And my baseline average for Warrior II was 50%, and my range was 10 to 60%. And in my intervention phase for Warrior II, my average was 93.75%, and my range was 70 to 100. In my downward dog, my baseline average was 35%, and my range was 17 to 50%. And in the intervention phase, my average was 87.5%, and my range was 67 to 100% correct. In my tree pose, my baseline average was 57%, and my range was 11 to 67%. And in the intervention phase, my average was 100%, and my range was 100 to 100.
All right, for my downward dog pose, my average baseline was 97%, and my intervention average was 100%. My Warrior II pose average was 97%, and my intervention average was 100%. And for my tree pose baseline average, which I never got to get out of due to a medical issue, my average was 55%.
Okay, and my baseline average for downward dog was 76%, and my range was 67 to 83%. My intervention average was 91.5, and my range was 83 to 100. My tree pose baseline average was 81.7, and my range was 67 to 89. The intervention for tree pose average was 95.6, and my range was 89% to 100%. My Warrior II pose had a baseline average of 65.4%, and the range was 50 to 80%. My intervention average for Warrior II pose was 87.5%, and the range for intervention was 70 to 100%.
My results for Warrior II, my baseline average was 90%. My baseline range was 90% to 90%. It didn't change. My intervention average was 97.5%, and intervention range was 90 to 100%. For tree pose, my baseline average was 91.2%. Baseline range 78 to 100%. Intervention average was 98.2%, and my intervention range was 89 to 100%. For downward facing dog, my baseline average was 77.8. My baseline range is 50% to 100%. Intervention average was 91.5%, and my intervention range was 83 to 100%.
So some limitations should be noted about this study. First, there were 2 members of the group in various stages of pregnancy, myself and Christy. One of the pregnant participants, me, and had just entered her 3rd trimester and faced challenges completing some of the poses, which may have skewed the data or the accuracy of my data. I also had to drop out of the study due to sustaining an injury during the study. This injury was not related to the study and occurred outside of study treatment. So therefore, my data revealed fewer sessions and no data for the intervention phase of the tree pose. So some limitations affecting the entire participant pool included the following: that there was not a yoga instructor present to model and aid in the first 2 baseline sessions, and the video model for the first 2 baseline sessions used in this study differs from the video modeling used in the original study. As researchers in the original study explained, for future research, looking at using this method across different sports, the original study also notes that using a task analysis alone instead of video modeling should be evaluated to determine if there would have been the same effect when self-monitoring visual is absent. For conclusion, the original study was the first yoga video self-evaluation to be conducted. In our study, replication, similar results were rendered as a functional relationship between baseline and intervention. Immediate feedback from reviewing video self-evaluation led the participants to successfully increase accuracy in poses. By requiring a participant to review and score a task analysis based on their current performance, skill accuracy can begin to improve. And as I stated, a functional relationship between baseline and intervention was present.